Chapter 1. After Eden, the angel's gift to Adam. When Adam and Eve walked out of the Garden of Eden, they carried with them something more profound than shame or regret. They carried questions that had never before troubled the human mind. What was death, this shadow that now followed them? How could they navigate a world no longer shaped by divine protection? Where would they find wisdom when the voice of God had grown distant? The Jewish mystical tradition holds that God, in His infinite compassion, did not abandon the first humans to stumble blindly through their new mortal existence. Instead, He dispatched an angel, a being whose very name means secret of God, or mystery of God. This was Raziel, the archangel who stands closest to the divine throne, who hears every whisper of cosmic wisdom, who knows the innermost workings of creation itself. Raziel descended to Adam, bearing a gift unlike any the first man had ever received. It was a book, but to call it merely a book fails to capture its significance. This was the Sefer Raziel HaMalach, a repository of knowledge so profound that it contained the secrets of the universe itself. Within its pages lay the mysteries of creation, the hidden names of God, the movements of celestial bodies, the properties of stones and plants, and the intricate workings of angels and demons. This was wisdom that could help humanity not merely survive, but understand their place in the grand architecture of existence. The circumstances of this gift reveal something essential about the nature of divine mercy. Adam had not asked for this knowledge. He had not performed some great penance or completed some heroic task. The book came to him in his lowest moment, when he was most vulnerable, most uncertain, most aware of his limitations. This timing suggests that the knowledge contained in the book of Raziel was never meant as a reward for righteousness, but as a tool for navigation through the complexities of mortal life. But who was this angel Raziel, and why was he chosen for such a momentous task? In the hierarchies of angels described in Jewish mystical literature, Raziel occupies a unique position. He is often depicted as standing behind the curtain that separates the created world from the divine presence, listening to the conversations of God with the highest angels, absorbing secrets that other celestial beings cannot access. His role is that of a keeper of mysteries, a guardian of knowledge too potent for ordinary revelation. The name Raziel itself carries layers of meaning in Hebrew. Razi means secret or mystery, while El is one of the names of God. Thus, Raziel is literally God's secret or mystery of God, a being whose essence is intertwined with hidden knowledge. In some traditions, he is called the Angel of Mysteries, or the Herald of the Deity, titles that emphasize his role as a bridge between the knowable and the unknowable. According to the legends, when Raziel gave the book to Adam, the other angels were troubled. They gathered in celestial council, questioning whether humanity was ready for such profound secrets. Some argued that this knowledge was too dangerous, that Adam and his descendants would misuse it, that the gap between human and divine wisdom should remain absolute. In their concern, or perhaps their jealousy, these angels stole the book from Adam and cast it into the ocean. Yet what the angels threw away, God retrieved. He commanded Rahab, the angel of the primordial waters, to recover the book and return it to Adam. This episode reveals something crucial about the Book of Raziel. It was not given casually, and its survival was not accidental. The knowledge it contained was meant for humanity, even over the objections of celestial beings. The very structure of creation, it seemed, required that humans have access to these mysteries. The book would pass through the hands of the patriarchs. From Adam it went to Enoch, that mysterious figure who walked with God and was taken up to heaven without experiencing death. Enoch, according to tradition, used the wisdom in the book to understand the secrets of the heavens and to record his own visions of the divine throne. From Enoch, the book passed to Noah, who used its knowledge to understand the precise dimensions and construction of the ark that would save life from the flood. Abraham possessed it, and its wisdom helped him understand the stars and the movements of celestial forces. It reached Solomon, who used its secrets to command demons and to build the temple with supernatural aid. The physical description of the book, as preserved in medieval Jewish texts, is itself remarkable. It was said to be written in a celestial script that could not be read by ordinary human perception, letters of black fire inscribed on white fire, characters that shifted and rearranged themselves according to the spiritual state of the reader. Some traditions claim the book was engraved on sapphire stone, others that it was written on the skin of a celestial beast. These descriptions, whether literal or metaphorical, emphasize the otherworldly nature of this text. The content of the Book of Raziel, as it has come down to us through various Hebrew manuscripts, is vast and often bewildering. It contains teachings on the secret names of God, those combinations of Hebrew letters that were believed to hold creative power. It describes the hierarchies of angels, their functions, and the proper ways to invoke their aid. It explains the mystical significance of the Hebrew alphabet, with each letter seen as a fundamental force of creation. It provides instructions for creating amulets, understanding dreams, and interpreting signs in nature. It maps the structure of the heavens, describing 7 palaces or halls through which the soul must pass to reach divine presence. Yet the book is more than a collection of magical formulas or esoteric diagrams. At its heart lies a profound philosophical teaching about the relationship between humanity and the divine. The very act of giving this book to Adam suggests that humans are meant to be seekers of wisdom, that the spiritual journey involves not blind faith alone, but understanding, not passive acceptance, but active inquiry. The Book of Raziel implies that the image of God in which humans are created includes the capacity and the calling to comprehend the deeper patterns of existence. The legend also carries a poignant emotional dimension. Imagine Adam, newly exiled from paradise, sitting in a world that suddenly felt hostile and strange. The familiar voice of God that once walked with him in the garden had withdrawn. The easy abundance of Eden had been replaced by toil and uncertainty. In that moment of profound alienation, an angel appeared bearing knowledge, offering not a return to innocence, but something perhaps more valuable, the tools to understand and navigate complexity. This was compassion expressed not through erasure of consequences, but through empowerment in the face of them. Chapter 2. Raziel, the Keeper of Divine Secrets. To understand the Book of Raziel, we must first understand the angel whose name it bears. Raziel, in Hebrew Raziel Hamalach, means secret of God, or mystery of God. This name alone tells us something essential about his function in the celestial hierarchy. He is not merely a messenger or guardian, but the keeper of divine mysteries, the angel who stands closest to the throne of the Almighty and hears the secrets that underpin creation itself. In Jewish mystical tradition, angels are not the winged humanoid figures of popular imagination, but rather forces, intelligences, channels through which divine will flows into the world. They exist in hierarchies, each order serving specific functions in the maintenance of cosmic order. Raziel belongs to the highest orders, often identified with the Ophanim or the cherubim, those beings described in the prophet Ezekiel's vision as wheels within wheels, covered with eyes, representing the omniscience of divine wisdom. The Zohar, the central text of Jewish mystical thought composed in 13th century Spain, describes Raziel as standing behind the curtain that separates the created world from the pure divine presence. Imagine this curtain, called in Hebrew the Pargod, as the boundary between the knowable and the unknowable, between manifestation and the infinite void from which all manifestation emerges. Raziel's position means he hears everything that is decreed before it comes into being. He knows the patterns before they become forms, the intentions before they become actions, the blueprints of reality before reality is built. This positioning gives Raziel a unique role. He is not merely a recorder of knowledge, but a guardian of the threshold. The secrets he keeps are dangerous, not because they are forbidden, but because they are powerful beyond measure. In the wrong hands or minds unprepared to receive them, such knowledge could shatter rather than enlighten. The mystics understood that divine wisdom is not morally neutral information, but transformative force. To know the true names of God, to understand the mechanics of creation, to perceive the hidden connections between all things, is to be changed utterly. When Raziel gave his book to Adam, he was performing an act that went against the expectations of other angels. The Midrash, those collections of rabbinical commentaries and elaborations on biblical texts, tells us that other angels were jealous. They argued that humanity, having already proven itself disobedient, did not deserve such knowledge. Some accounts say these angels stole the book from Adam and threw it into the ocean, only for God to command the angel Rahab, prince of the sea, to retrieve it and return it. This detail, whether historical or symbolic, emphasizes a crucial point. The transmission of wisdom to humanity was contested, extraordinary, a divine decision that overruled even angelic concerns. What did these objecting angels fear? Perhaps they understood that knowledge changes the knower. Adam, before the fall, existed in a state of immediate relationship with the divine, requiring no mediation, no interpretation, no effort of understanding. After the fall, humanity entered the realm of separation, where God was no longer immediately present but had to be sought, where truth was no longer obvious but had to be discovered. The Book of Raziel represented an adaptation to this new condition. It provided humanity with tools for the exile, methods to rebuild connection across the gap that had opened between heaven and earth. Raziel's teachings in the book reflect his unique vantage point. They deal with the infrastructure of reality, the hidden grammar by which the universe operates. The secret names of God that the book contains are not arbitrary labels, but rather vibrational patterns, combinations of Hebrew letters that correspond to fundamental forces. In Jewish mysticism, language is not a human invention imposed on a mute world, but the very substance of creation. God spoke the world into being, and the Hebrew letters are the building blocks of that speech. To know these combinations, to pronounce them correctly with proper intention, is to align oneself with the creative power that flows from the divine source. Similarly, the angelic hierarchies described in the book are not organizational charts, but maps of consciousness. Each order of angels represents a different mode of divine presence, a different frequency of spiritual reality. To understand them is to understand the multiple levels on which existence operates simultaneously, from the most refined spiritual realms to the most concrete physical manifestations. The journey through the 7 heavenly palaces, described in the book's cosmology, mirrors the journey of human consciousness, expanding from surface awareness to deeper and deeper understanding of what lies behind appearances. The mystical significance of the Hebrew alphabet, explored at length in the Book of Raziel, connects language to creation in the most intimate way. Each letter is associated with a number, a sound, a shape, a divine quality, and a practical effect in the world. The letter Aleph, silent yet foundational, represents the primordial unity before creation. The letter Bet, with which the Torah begins, represents duality, the split that allows relationship and therefore existence. To contemplate these letters is to contemplate the mechanics of how something emerges from nothing, how the infinite contracts itself to make room for the finite. Raziel's book also addresses the practical concerns of embodied existence. Instructions for creating protective amulets acknowledge that life in the world involves vulnerability and danger. Methods for interpreting dreams recognize that human consciousness operates on multiple levels simultaneously, with nighttime visions offering access to knowledge unavailable to waking awareness. Techniques for reading signs in nature assume that the world is not random chaos but meaningful order, that patterns in the flight of birds or the growth of plants can reveal larger truths to those trained to perceive them. But we must be careful not to reduce the Book of Raziel to a grimoire of spells, a collection of magical recipes for manipulating reality. The deeper teaching concerns the nature of the human being as a bridge between heaven and earth, matter and spirit, the finite and the infinite. Adam's very name, connected to the Hebrew words for earth and blood, marks him as a creature of the ground. Yet the divine breath blown into that earthly form makes him something more, a being who participates in both realms. The knowledge Raziel brings acknowledges and addresses this dual nature, providing guidance for beings who are neither purely physical nor purely spiritual but uncomfortably, gloriously both. Chapter 3. The Journey of the Book, from Adam to Noah. The question of what happened to this sacred book after it was given becomes as mysterious as its origins. According to the legends that grew around it, the Book of Raziel did not remain safely in Adam's possession. The other angels, jealous of this gift to humanity, stole the book and cast it into the ocean. But God commanded the sea angel Rahab to retrieve it and return it to Adam. This story of loss and recovery suggests something essential about the nature of sacred knowledge. It cannot be permanently destroyed or hidden. What is meant to be known will find its way back, rising from depths into which it has been thrown. Adam kept the book throughout his remaining years on earth, consulting it for understanding of the divine order he had left behind. When death approached, the tradition holds that he passed it to his son Seth, the third son born after Cain's exile. Seth had been conceived, according to Genesis, in Adam's likeness and image, a replacement for the murdered Abel. If Cain represented the human capacity for violence and alienation, Seth represented the possibility of continuity, of maintaining connection with the sacred across generations. The choice to give the book to Seth rather than to the firstborn Cain carries obvious symbolic weight. Sacred knowledge requires worthy vessels, recipients who will honor rather than exploit what they receive. From Seth, the book passed through the generations of the righteous, moving through the line of patriarchs who maintained awareness of the divine presence in an increasingly corrupted world. The text was not for everyone. Many generations lived and died without knowledge of its existence. It moved quietly through history, held by those who could understand its contents and protect its secrets. Enoch, the mysterious figure who walked with God and was taken up without experiencing death, possessed the book during his earthly life. His familiarity with its contents may explain his unique fate, his ability to traverse the boundary between heaven and earth while still in human form. Then came the flood. The wickedness of humanity had grown so great that God determined to wash the world clean, to begin again with righteous Noah and his family. As the waters rose to cover the earth, destroying every living thing not sheltered in the ark, what became of the sacred knowledge? The legend provides an answer that preserves both continuity and transformation. The angel Raphael, whose name means God heals, appeared to Noah and gave him the book of Raziel. Some versions suggest Noah had inherited it through the patriarchal line. Others claim it had been lost and was restored specifically for the crisis of the flood. Either way, Noah now possessed the angelic wisdom at the moment of humanity's greatest trial. Inside the ark, surrounded by the sounds of rising water and frightened animals, Noah consulted the book. It taught him how to care for the diverse creatures under his protection, how to feed them and heal them and keep peace among species that would normally prey upon each other. The practical knowledge in the book of Raziel extended to veterinary medicine, to understanding the natures and needs of all living things. This detail in the legend reveals something important about the scope of sacred wisdom. It encompasses not just abstract spiritual truths, but concrete knowledge about the physical world, about the care of bodies and the sustaining of life. When the waters receded and Noah's ark came to rest on Mount Ararat, he carried the book with him into the renewed world. He consulted it as he planted the first vineyard, as he established the covenant with God symbolized by the rainbow. The knowledge of angels guided the first steps of humanity's second beginning, just as it had illuminated Adam's first steps outside Eden. The pattern repeats. At each crucial transition, at each moment when humanity must learn to live in a new way, the book reappears to provide guidance. But the story does not end with Noah. The book continued its journey through history, appearing at pivotal moments, held by those who stood at the intersection of the human and the divine. Abraham possessed it, according to the tradition, and its teachings informed his revolutionary understanding of monotheism. Solomon received it, and from its pages learned the wisdom that made him legendary. The book moved through time like a golden thread, connecting those individuals who served as channels for knowledge that transcended their particular moment in history. Chapter 4. The medieval discovery when legend became text. Yet this golden thread, brilliant as it was in legend, leaves us with a profound mystery. If the book of Raziel truly passed through the hands of Adam, Noah, Abraham, and Solomon, where is it now? When did the ethereal book of angels become the physical manuscripts we can examine today? The answer lies not in the ancient world of these patriarchs, but in the crucible of medieval Jewish mysticism, in the intellectual ferment of 13th century Spain and Germany. The Book of Raziel, as we know it today, emerged from the hands of medieval scribes and mystics who believed they were not creating something new, but recovering something ancient. They saw themselves as channels through which the primordial wisdom would flow once more into the world. In the Jewish communities of medieval Europe, particularly among the Hasidei Ashkenaz, the German Pietists, a profound hunger existed for direct access to the divine mysteries. These were communities living under persecution, seeking spiritual sustenance that transcended their difficult circumstances. They turned to mystical texts as windows into realms that earthly powers could not touch. The compilation of Sefer Raziel HaMalach, its Hebrew title, likely occurred in the 13th century, though it drew upon much older sources. The text that crystallized in this period was not the work of a single author but a mosaic, a careful assembly of earlier mystical traditions, magical formulas, and cosmological speculations that had circulated for centuries in oral and fragmentary written forms. The medieval compilers acted as curators of sacred knowledge, gathering scattered fragments and weaving them into a coherent whole. The mystical community known as the Hasidei Ashkenaz played a crucial role in this process. These German Jewish pietists, led by figures like Rabbi Judah the Pious and his disciple Eleazar of Worms, pursued a distinctive form of mysticism that combined ethical rigor with esoteric speculation. They believed in a hidden dimension to Torah, layers of meaning accessible only to those who had purified their hearts and refined their understanding. For them, the act of compiling mystical texts was itself a spiritual practice, a way of participating in the divine work of revelation. The structure of the medieval Book of Raziel reveals the concerns of its compilers. It contains sections on cosmology, describing the structure of the heavens and the movements of celestial bodies. It includes extensive angelology, cataloging the names and functions of countless angelic beings. It presents magical formulas and divine names believed to possess protective and healing powers. It offers detailed instructions for amulets and talismans. And woven throughout, it contains fragments of what purports to be the original wisdom given to Adam, teachings about the nature of creation and humanity's place within it. The language of the text itself provides clues to its origins. Written primarily in Hebrew, it incorporates terms and concepts from earlier Jewish mystical traditions, including the Merkava mysticism that focused on visions of the divine chariot described by the prophet Ezekiel. The text shows awareness of Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation, an earlier mystical work exploring the creative power of Hebrew letters and numbers. It draws on Talmudic traditions and midrashic interpretations while pushing beyond the boundaries of mainstream rabbinic thought. But the medieval Book of Raziel also reflects its own time in unmistakable ways. The emphasis on protective magic addresses the real dangers medieval Jewish communities faced. The elaborate angelology responds to a worldview in which unseen forces constantly impinged on daily life. The cosmological sections engage with the scientific understanding of the medieval period, attempting to reconcile traditional religious wisdom with contemporary knowledge of astronomy and natural philosophy. The compilers were not simply preserving ancient wisdom, they were translating it into terms meaningful for their own age. The manuscript tradition of the Book of Raziel reveals how it spread through medieval Jewish communities. Multiple manuscript copies survive from different regions and periods, each showing slight variations that reflect the concerns of particular scribes and communities. Some manuscripts emphasize the magical formulas, others the cosmological teachings, still others the ethical and devotional dimensions. The text proved remarkably adaptable, capable of speaking to varied needs and interests. One of the most influential manuscript traditions emerged in Italy, where Jewish mystical thought encountered both Islamic and Christian esoteric traditions. The Italian manuscripts often show greater sophistication in their cosmological sections, reflecting engagement with Aristotelian philosophy as transmitted through Arabic sources. They demonstrate how the Book of Raziel served not only as a repository of Jewish wisdom, but as a point of dialogue with the broader mystical and philosophical currents of the medieval Mediterranean world. The question of authorship remained deliberately ambiguous. The medieval compilers made no claim to have written the book themselves. Instead, they presented their work as the recovery and arrangement of ancient materials, as acts of transmission rather than creation. This stance reflected both humility and authority. Humility, in that they did not claim the text as their own achievement. Authority, in that they positioned themselves as custodians of authentic primordial wisdom. By attributing the ultimate source to the angel Raziel and to Adam, they located their text outside the contingencies of history, in the realm of eternal truth. The process of compilation involved careful selection from a vast body of mystical lore. Not everything was included. The compilers exercised judgment about what belonged in a text, claiming to represent the wisdom God gave to Adam. They shaped the material to present a coherent vision of the cosmos, of humanity's spiritual capacities, and of the paths available for approaching the divine. In this sense, the medieval Book of Raziel represents a particular moment of synthesis in Jewish mystical thought, a crystallization of centuries of esoteric speculation into a form that could be transmitted to future generations. Chapter 5. The Architecture of Heaven, Palaces Beyond Mortal Sight. The synthesis achieved by the medieval compilers created a foundation, but the content they preserved reveals something far older and more intricate. Embedded within the text lies a vision of reality that extends far beyond the visible world, a cosmology that maps not only physical space but spiritual dimensions inaccessible to ordinary perception. The Book of Raziel describes a universe of layered realms, celestial palaces, and angelic hierarchies, a cosmos where the material world represents merely the outermost shell of an infinitely more complex reality. This cosmological vision begins with a fundamental premise that the visible universe mirrors invisible structures. Every physical phenomenon corresponds to a spiritual archetype. The stars in the night sky reflect the ordered array of angelic beings. The rhythms of nature echo the movements of divine forces through higher realms. Understanding the cosmos, according to this perspective, requires perceiving these correspondences, recognizing how the material world serves as a shadow or reflection of realities that exist in dimensions beyond spatial extension. The text describes 7 heavens, each a distinct realm with its own characteristics, inhabitants, and relationship to the divine source. These are not merely horizontal layers stacked one above another, but qualitatively different modes of existence, each representing a greater degree of proximity to the infinite. The lowest heaven contains the celestial bodies familiar to earthly observers, the sun and moon and stars that govern the cycles of time. Here, angels oversee the mechanics of the physical cosmos, ensuring that planetary orbits maintain their courses and that the seasons arrive in their appointed order. The second heaven houses the angels who record human deeds. Here exists what the text calls the celestial archive, an imperishable record of every action, word, and thought that has occurred since creation began. Nothing is forgotten in this realm. Every consequence of human choice remains inscribed in patterns of light that these recording angels preserve and present before divine judgment. The notion that such comprehensive accountability exists created both comfort and terror for those who contemplated it. Comfort in knowing that justice would ultimately prevail. Terror in recognizing that nothing remains hidden. As one ascends through the higher heavens, the realms become increasingly difficult to describe in ordinary language. The third heaven contains what the text calls the Garden of Righteousness, where the souls of the particularly virtuous dwell in a state of bliss while awaiting final resurrection. The fourth heaven houses the celestial Jerusalem, the ideal city that exists as a template for earthly communities of faith. This is not a metaphorical construct, but an actual location in spiritual geography, a city of light where perfected souls study divine wisdom under the direct instruction of angels. The fifth and sixth heavens contain the angelic hosts themselves, arranged in hierarchies of increasing power and proximity to the divine presence. These realms function as both dwelling places and command structures, where angels receive their missions and return to report on their fulfillment. The text describes vast assemblies where millions of spiritual beings gather to sing praises that reverberate through all levels of reality, their voices creating harmonies that sustain the very fabric of existence. The seventh heaven, however, remains beyond full description. This is the location of the divine throne, the point where created reality interfaces with the infinite source of all being. The Book of Raziel approaches this realm with language that deliberately fails, words that gesture toward experiences that cannot be captured in human concepts. Those few souls who have glimpsed this highest realm, the text suggests, return transformed beyond recognition, carrying within them a light that marks them as having touched the boundary of what consciousness can endure. Within these heavenly realms exist structures the text calls palaces or temples, spiritual architecture that serves purposes beyond anything physical buildings could accomplish. These are not constructed of stone or wood, but of condensed divine light, solidified radiance that takes forms corresponding to their functions. The palaces serve as courts, libraries, sanctuaries, and schools, each designed for specific aspects of angelic activity and for the instruction of human souls permitted to enter them. Chapter 6. The Sacred Names, Language as Gateway to Power. The palaces of the heavenly realms contain more than angelic beings and divine light. Within their walls exist libraries of a particular kind, repositories not of books but of names. The Book of Raziel describes these archives as places where every designation of the divine is preserved, where the very names by which God may be addressed are stored like precious gems, each one a key to a different aspect of infinite reality. Names in the cosmology this text presents are not arbitrary labels attached to things after their creation. They are instead the essential patterns through which divine intention takes form, the vibrational blueprints that call phenomena into being. When God speaks a name, the text suggests that utterance does not describe something already existing, but rather creates the very thing it names. The act of naming and the act of creating collapse into a single moment of manifestation. The 72-letter name of God, referenced throughout mystical Jewish tradition, appears in the Book of Raziel as a fundamental structure underlying reality itself. This name, too long and complex to be pronounced as a single word, functions instead as a matrix of divine attributes, each letter or combination representing a particular channel through which creative power flows into the world. Those who understand the proper arrangement and vocalization of these letters, the text claims, can access powers that reshape the fabric of existence. But the text issues stern warnings about the misuse of such knowledge. Names of power are not tools to be wielded casually, not instruments for personal gain or the satisfaction of egoic desires. They are instead sacred trusts, gifts that carry tremendous responsibility. The Book of Raziel describes individuals who attempted to use divine names without proper preparation, without the spiritual refinement necessary to contain such energies. The results, it suggests, were catastrophic, not only for the practitioners but for those around them. The angels themselves bear names that reveal their functions and natures. Michael, whose name means "who is like God," serves as both warrior and protector. Gabriel, strength of God, acts as messenger and herald. Raphael, God heals, brings restoration and wholeness. Each angelic designation encodes within it the specific quality of divine action that being embodies and channels into lower realms. Human names, too, carry significance beyond social convention. The Book of Raziel suggests that the names given to individuals at birth or bestowed through spiritual initiation contain encoded information about their destiny, their particular role in the unfolding of cosmic purpose. Changing one's name, a practice found in many mystical traditions, represents not mere preference, but a fundamental alteration in one's spiritual identity and trajectory. The Hebrew alphabet itself receives treatment as more than a writing system. Each of its 22 letters corresponds to a cosmic principle, a pathway of divine emanation, a frequency of creative energy. The letter Aleph represents the unity underlying all apparent multiplicity. Bet, the second letter, signifies the principle of duality and manifestation. Through the entire alphabet runs a sequence of meanings that, when properly understood, reveals the process by which the infinite becomes finite. The unmanifest takes form. This understanding of language as fundamentally creative, rather than merely descriptive, transforms the act of speaking into something approaching ritual magic. Every word uttered, the text implies, sends ripples through the fabric of reality, strengthening or weakening particular patterns of manifestation. Speech becomes a form of continuous creation, an ongoing participation in the divine act of bringing worlds into being. The text describes practices by which properly prepared individuals might use combinations of letters and divine names to accomplish specific purposes. These are not spells in the sense of formulaic incantations guaranteed to produce results regardless of the practitioner's state. They are instead precise alignments of consciousness with particular channels of divine energy, requiring both technical knowledge and spiritual purity to function as intended. Chapter 7. The Tree of Life and the Sephirot. Beyond the letters themselves, the text describes a vast cosmological architecture known as the Tree of Life, a diagram of how divine essence flows from infinite source into finite manifestation. This structure consists of 10 emanations called Sephirot, each representing a particular quality or aspect of divine creativity as it descends from absolute unity into the multiplicity of created worlds. At the crown stands Keter, representing the unknowable will that precedes all manifestation, the first stirring of intention within infinite consciousness. From this flows Chokmah, divine wisdom as pure intuitive insight, followed by Binah, understanding that gives form to wisdom's flashes of illumination. These three constitute the supernal realm, closest to the source, barely comprehensible to embodied awareness. Below these unfold 7 Sephirot of construction, each governing particular dimensions of created reality. Chesed embodies loving expansion, the generous outpouring of divine abundance. Gevura provides necessary limitation, the discipline that prevents expansion from dissolving into chaos. Tiferet harmonizes these opposites, establishing beauty through balanced proportion. The pattern continues downward through Netzach, endurance that sustains patterns across time, and Hod, splendor that crystallizes forms into precise definition. Yesod gathers and concentrates these forces before Malchut. The kingdom receives them as the material world itself, the final stage where invisible principles become tangible reality. The entire structure functions as both map and pathway, describing how consciousness might ascend back toward its source. Chapter 8. Practical Magic, the Art of Sacred Protection. This cosmological framework, however lofty its architecture, never existed merely as abstract speculation. The Book of Raziel transforms metaphysical doctrine into tangible practice, offering detailed instructions for engaging these forces through ritual action. Where philosophy contemplates divine emanation from a distance, the grimoire's practical sections provide tools for direct interaction, methods by which embodied consciousness might harness celestial currents for earthly purposes. The text preserves extensive catalogs of angelic names, each associated with specific planetary spheres and corresponding powers. These names function not as arbitrary labels but as vibrational keys, sonic patterns believed to resonate with particular frequencies of divine consciousness. To invoke Raphael, angel of healing associated with Mercury's sphere, requires precise pronunciation of Hebrew syllables, each letter carrying numerical and symbolic weight. The practitioner becomes a kind of spiritual linguist, speaking in tongues that bridge human and angelic registers. Accompanying these invocations are elaborate seal designs, geometric configurations meant to concentrate and direct spiritual forces. A typical healing seal might combine the planet's astrological symbol, Hebrew letters spelling relevant divine names, and intricate interlacing patterns forming a visual mandala. Medieval manuscripts preserve these diagrams with meticulous care, suggesting they were not merely decorative but functionally essential. The seal operates as spiritual technology, a device for channeling invisible energies into manifest effects. The grimoire's medical sections reveal particularly detailed applications of this theoretical framework. Illness appears in these texts as spiritual disruption before physical symptom, imbalance in the subtle body that eventually manifests as corporeal disease. Treatment, therefore, addresses both levels simultaneously. A remedy for fever might combine herbal medicine with prayers invoking cooling angelic forces, the preparation of ingredients timed to planetary hours when relevant celestial influences reach maximum potency. The concept of auspicious timing pervades these practical instructions. The text presents elaborate tables correlating hours of the day with planetary rulers, days of the week with angelic governors, lunar phases with magical operations. A protection ritual performed during Tuesday's hour of Mars under a waxing moon draws upon entirely different cosmic currents than the same ritual conducted during Venus's hour on Friday evening. The practitioner becomes an astrologer of opportunity, weighing for moments when celestial machinery aligns favorably. Protective magic receives especially thorough treatment, reflecting the perpetual anxiety about demonic interference that haunted medieval consciousness. The grimoire describes amulets inscribed with divine names, talismans prepared according to strict ritual protocols, threshold blessings to guard homes against malevolent spirits. One particularly elaborate procedure involves preparing parchment from an unblemished animal, writing specific psalms with ink made from sacred ingredients, folding the document according to geometric principles, and carrying it in a silk pouch against the body. Each element carries symbolic weight, the entire assemblage functioning as a kind of spiritual armor. The boundary between devotion and manipulation grows notably thin in these sections. Prayers appear structured as transactions, offerings made in expectation of specific returns. Divine forces become something like natural laws, predictable and manipulable by those possessing proper knowledge. This pragmatic approach to sacred power distinguishes grimoire literature from purely devotional texts, revealing a worldview where efficacy matters more than piety, where knowing the right words and gestures grants access to cosmic mechanisms. Yet beneath this instrumental approach persists a profound sense of dependency on divine grace. The most powerful incantations include requests for permission, acknowledgments that human will alone achieves nothing without alignment with higher purposes. The practitioner operates not through personal power, but as a channel for forces infinitely greater than individual consciousness. This paradox defines the grimoire's spiritual logic. Human agency matters tremendously, yet ultimately counts for nothing without divine cooperation. The rituals themselves demand elaborate preparation, extended periods of purification through fasting, prayer, and abstinence before attempting major operations. The practitioner becomes a kind of spiritual athlete, training consciousness toward receptivity to higher influences. The grimoire describes this preparation in minute detail, specifying numbers of days, particular prayers to recite, ritual baths to perform, even dietary restrictions to observe. The physical body becomes an instrument requiring careful tuning before it can serve as vessel for sacred forces. Material components receive equally precise attention. Specific herbs gathered at particular moon phases, metals associated with planetary influences, gemstones carrying sympathetic resonances with celestial powers. A love charm might require copper ruled by Venus, rose petals picked at dawn, honey from bees that visited flowers under favorable astrological conditions. The natural world appears saturated with occult correspondences, every substance vibrating at frequencies that harmonize or clash with spiritual intentions. The grimoire's dream interpretation sections reveal another dimension of practical application. Dreams appear as messages from higher realms, symbolic communications requiring skilled decoding. The text provides extensive catalogs of dream symbols and their meanings, keys for translating nocturnal visions into actionable insight. A dream of ascending stairs suggests spiritual progress. Descending indicates setback. Water portends emotional turbulence or purification depending on its clarity. The sleeping mind becomes a receiver for angelic broadcasts, messages from consciousness unbound by waking limitations. Particularly intriguing are the grimoire's instructions for acquiring knowledge through visionary experience. Certain rituals promise direct encounters with angelic teachers, guided journeys through celestial spheres, glimpses of divine realities normally hidden from embodied awareness. These procedures involve extended meditation, specific breathing patterns, visualization of ascending through planetary spheres, invocation of guardians governing each level. The text describes altered states where linear time dissolves, where consciousness expands beyond ordinary boundaries, where direct knowing replaces discursive reasoning. The dangers receive frank acknowledgement. Premature attempts at advanced practices risk psychological disintegration, spiritual crisis, or worse. The grimoire warns repeatedly against approaching these methods casually, insisting on proper preparation, pure intention, and ideally guidance from experienced practitioners. The boundaries being crossed separate ordinary consciousness from forces that can overwhelm unprepared minds. Spiritual ambition, without corresponding ethical development, leads not to enlightenment, but to delusion and harm. This practical magic exists in constant tension with orthodox religious authority. Church officials generally condemn such texts, viewing attempts to command angels as presumptuous blasphemy. Yet the grimoire's defenders argued they practiced nothing more than especially intense prayer, that seeking angelic assistance differed little from petitioning saints for intercession. The debate reveals fundamental questions about human relationship with sacred power, whether such forces should be approached only through humble supplication or whether divine gifts include capacity for more active engagement. The survival of these texts, despite official disapproval, suggests they addressed needs that conventional religious practice left unfulfilled. People facing illness, danger, uncertainty sought tools for addressing immediate crises, methods for exercising some agency in circumstances that felt overwhelming. The grimoire offered not just comfort but technique, not merely hope but procedure. In a world where forces beyond human control shaped daily existence, these practices promised at least the possibility of influence, the chance that proper knowledge might tip cosmic scales toward favorable outcomes. Modern readers encounter these instructions across an immense cultural divide. The worldview they assume, where angels govern planetary movements and Hebrew syllables carry inherent power, seems utterly foreign to scientific materialist consciousness. Yet something in these practices continues to resonate, perhaps their recognition that consciousness itself remains mysteriously effective, that intention and attention shape experience in ways not fully explained by reductive models. The grimoire preserves an ancient conviction that mind and matter interpenetrate, that invisible patterns precede and determine visible forms. The practical sections ultimately reveal the Book of Raziel's deepest purpose. This was never merely a theological treatise or historical curiosity, but a manual for transformation, instructions for those seeking not just to understand divine mysteries, but to participate in them directly. The cosmology provides context, the philosophy offers framework, but the rituals constitute the core offering, techniques through which ordinary consciousness might expand toward extraordinary capacity. Whether these methods produce their claimed effects remains open to debate, but their preservation across centuries testifies to persistent human longing for connection with something greater than individual existence, for practical means of touching the transcendent. Chapter 9. The Thread Through Time: How Ancient Wisdom Shaped Mystical Tradition. The techniques preserved in these pages did not remain isolated curiosities, forgotten relics of an alien worldview. Instead, they became seeds from which entire gardens of mystical practice would grow. The grimoire's influence extended far beyond its immediate historical moment, shaping the development of Jewish mysticism across subsequent centuries. The cosmology it sketched, the divine names it cataloged, the angelic hierarchies it detailed, these elements would reappear throughout later Kabbalistic literature, sometimes acknowledged, often unattributed, but unmistakably present. Tracing this influence requires careful attention to textual lineages, to the ways ideas migrate between manuscripts, transform through copying, adapt to new contexts. The Book of Raziel never existed, in a single definitive version. Instead, it proliferated in multiple recensions, each reflecting the concerns of its particular time and community. Medieval manuscripts from German Jewish communities emphasized protective practices, amulets against immediate physical dangers. Spanish versions incorporated more elaborate cosmological speculation, integrating Neoplatonic concepts that circulated in Andalusian intellectual circles. Eastern European editions added folk traditions, healing formulae, practices for addressing the everyday crises of village life. This textual fluidity makes establishing direct lines of influence challenging. Kabbalists rarely cited sources with modern scholarly precision. They worked within a tradition that valued transmission over attribution, where authority derived from antiquity rather than originality. A practice or concept might appear in one text, then resurface decades later in another manuscript with no explicit acknowledgement of connection. Yet patterns emerge when we examine the whole corpus. Certain combinations of divine names, specific angelic designations, particular cosmological schemas appear repeatedly, suggesting shared textual ancestry even when direct copying cannot be proven. The Zohar, that massive compilation of mystical commentary assembled in 13th century Spain, shows clear conceptual debts to the Book of Raziel tradition. Its elaborate descriptions of divine emanations, its detailed angelology, its practices involving divine name combinations, all echo elements present in earlier Raziel manuscripts. The Zohar transformed these materials, embedding them in sophisticated theological frameworks, but the underlying techniques remain recognizable. Where the grimoire offered practical instructions without extensive philosophical justification, the Zohar provided rich mythological context, narratives that explained why these practices worked, what cosmic mechanisms they engaged. This elaboration served multiple purposes. It elevated magical technique to theological significance, showing how practical application reflected deep truths about divine nature and human potential. It also provided protective coloration, framing potentially controversial practices in respectable interpretive discourse. A ritual for binding angels became an exploration of how divine will manifests through angelic agency. An amulet formula transformed into meditation on the protective power inherent in sacred language itself. The Zohar took the grimoire's raw materials and wove them into tapestries of meaning that satisfied both practical and intellectual needs. Later Kabbalistic schools built on these foundations. The Safed circle of 16th century mystics, perhaps medieval Judaism's most creative mystical flowering, incorporated techniques traceable to Raziel traditions. Isaac Luria's revolutionary cosmology, with its elaborate accounts of cosmic catastrophe and repair, employed divine name combinations and angelic invocations that echo the grimoire's formulas. His meditative practices for achieving mystical ascent, his techniques for rectifying cosmic and personal flaws, these borrowed conceptual tools the grimoire had preserved in simpler form. The transmission occurred through multiple channels. Direct manuscript copying represented just one pathway. Teachers passed techniques to students orally, demonstrations of practice accompanying written instruction. Communities developed local variations, adapting standard formulas to address specific circumstances. A protective amulet formula that originally guarded against demonic attack might be modified to protect pregnant women, to ensure safe childbirth, to defend infants against childhood diseases. The basic structure remained recognizable, but application shifted to meet immediate community needs. This adaptability ensured survival. Texts that remained rigid, locked into the concerns of their original moment, tended to ossify into historical curiosities. But materials that could evolve, that invited creative adaptation while maintaining core techniques, continued to feel relevant across changing circumstances. The Book of Raziel succeeded precisely because it offered flexible frameworks rather than rigid prescriptions, templates that practitioners could customize while following established patterns. The grimoire's influence extended beyond Jewish mysticism proper. Its techniques and concepts seeped into broader streams of Western esoteric tradition. Medieval Christian magicians borrowed its angelic names and seals, incorporating them into Latin grimoires with minimal acknowledgement of Hebrew origins. Renaissance magi like Pico della Mirandola encountered Kabbalistic practices through texts that drew heavily on Raziel traditions, seeing in them ancient wisdom compatible with Platonic philosophy and Christian theology. This cross-pollination produced hybrid practices, syncretistic systems that combined elements from multiple traditions into novel configurations. These migrations raise questions about cultural appropriation and authenticity. When Christian practitioners adopted Jewish mystical techniques, divorcing them from their original religious context, did something essential get lost? The divine names ceased to be sacred, Hebrew invocations of the God of Israel, becoming instead neutral magical tools, syllables whose power derived from phonetic properties rather than covenant relationship. Angels originally understood as servants of the biblical God, transformed into quasi-independent spiritual entities, forces that might serve any practitioner with sufficient knowledge regardless of religious identity. Yet these transformations also testify to perceived efficacy. Practitioners adopted these techniques because they believed them to work, because they seemed to produce desired results more reliably than alternatives. The migration of Raziel material into Christian magic suggests that something in these practices transcended their original cultural matrix, some core of technique that remained functional even when theological justification changed. This portability might indicate that the methods engaged genuinely universal principles, patterns of consciousness, or subtle reality that operate regardless of religious framework. Within Jewish tradition itself, attitudes toward this material remained perpetually ambiguous. Mainstream rabbinic authorities never fully endorsed grimoire practices, maintaining skepticism about magical technique even when acknowledging angelic reality. Yet neither could they completely suppress these traditions. Too many people found them valuable, too many communities relied on them, too many respected figures practiced them for outright prohibition to succeed. Instead, a complex accommodation developed, where practical Kabbalah existed in tension with but not complete opposition to normative religious practice. This tension produced its own creative dynamics. The need to justify magical technique pushed practitioners toward increasingly sophisticated theological rationales, arguments for why invoking angels or using divine names properly aligned with, rather than violated, monotheistic principles. These justifications enriched Jewish philosophy, forcing serious engagement with questions about divine immanence, the mechanics of providence, the relationship between natural and supernatural causation. The grimoire tradition, by creating problems that demanded resolution, stimulated theological creativity. The influence also flowed in reverse directions. As Kabbalistic thought grew more elaborate, those developments fed back into practical texts. Later manuscripts of the Book of Raziel incorporated concepts from sophisticated mystical philosophy, embedding simple techniques in complex cosmological frameworks. A straightforward protective formula might be accompanied by lengthy explanation of what angelic realms it engaged, what divine emanations it activated, how it participated in cosmic processes of judgment and mercy. The grimoire absorbed the very traditions it had helped spawn, becoming increasingly layered, increasingly dense with accumulated interpretation. This recursive development makes determining original sources nearly impossible. Did a particular practice originate in early Raziel manuscripts and later receive philosophical elaboration, or did it emerge from Kabbalistic speculation and subsequently get incorporated into grimoire compilations? The manuscripts themselves offer few definitive answers. Scribes freely mixed materials from different periods and traditions, creating composite texts that defy simple chronological analysis. We encounter palimpsests of practice, where ancient techniques and medieval innovations sit side by side, indistinguishable without extensive comparative analysis. Modern scholars approaching this material face methodological challenges. The rational impulse to establish clear lineages, to map precise influences, to distinguish original compositions from later additions, this encounters sources that actively resist such clarification. The tradition itself valued syncretism over purity, transmission over innovation, collective wisdom over individual authorship. Attempting to impose modern standards of textual criticism risks missing how the tradition actually functioned, how practitioners themselves understood and valued these materials. Perhaps more productive approaches recognize the grimoire as living tradition rather than fixed text, as ongoing conversation across centuries rather than artifact from single moment. The Book of Raziel that influenced 13th century Kabbalists differed from the version 16th century Polish Jews consulted, which differed again from what 18th century Hasidic masters encountered. Yet all remained recognizably the same work, variations on shared themes rather than entirely distinct compositions. This fluid stability, this continuity through transformation, characterized how esoteric knowledge actually transmitted across generations. The grimoire's influence on Jewish mysticism ultimately testifies to the enduring human need for practical spirituality, for techniques that bridge everyday existence and transcendent reality. Philosophical speculation satisfies intellectual curiosity. Ethical teaching provides moral guidance, but neither fully addresses the visceral desire to affect circumstance through spiritual means, to exercise some agency in realms normally beyond human control. The Book of Raziel preserved and transmitted methods for attempting exactly this, techniques through which ordinary individuals might engage extraordinary dimensions of existence. This practical orientation distinguished it from purely speculative mysticism. The grimoire never aspired to be merely interesting, intellectually stimulating, but practically inert. It offered itself as useful knowledge, information meant for application rather than contemplation. This utilitarian character ensured continued relevance even as worldviews shifted, because human needs, the desire for protection, healing, understanding, guidance, these remain constant across changing cultural contexts. The specific cosmology might seem increasingly alien, but the underlying impulse to somehow touch and be touched by sacred reality, this persisted. Contemporary interest in these materials reflects this same perennial concern. Modern practitioners who study historical grimoires are not typically seeking historical knowledge for its own sake, but hoping to recover functional techniques, methods that might work now as they apparently worked then. This instrumentalist approach sometimes troubles scholars, who prefer treating texts as historical documents rather than living resources. Yet it also honors how the tradition itself functioned, as practical wisdom transmitted between generations, specifically because it addressed ongoing needs. The Book of Raziel thus stands at the source of a stream that continues flowing into the present. Every contemporary practitioner of practical Kabbalah, every modern magician working with angelic invocations or divine names, every spiritual seeker attempting meditation with Hebrew letters, all participate knowingly or unknowingly in traditions this grimoire helped establish. The specific practices may have evolved beyond recognition, the theological frameworks transformed almost beyond relation, but the fundamental impulse, the conviction that proper knowledge and technique can enable conscious engagement with spiritual dimensions, this inheritance from Raziel's ancient instruction to Adam persists across all subsequent elaborations and adaptations. Chapter 10. The Legacy of Forbidden Knowledge, from Medieval Grimoire to Modern Mysticism. This continuity of purpose across vast spans of time reveals something profound about the human relationship with sacred knowledge. The grimoire format itself proved remarkably resilient, adapting to new contexts while maintaining essential characteristics. As printed books became available in the 15th and 16th centuries, manuscript traditions of magical texts transitioned into new forms of circulation. The Book of Raziel participated in this transformation, its Hebrew editions appearing alongside Latin translations and vernacular adaptations throughout Europe. The printing press, often celebrated as an engine of enlightenment and rational thought, also facilitated the spread of esoteric materials. Occult manuscripts that had previously circulated among small networks of initiates suddenly became available to broader audiences. This democratization of mystical knowledge alarmed religious authorities across denominational lines. Both Catholic and Protestant censors attempted to suppress such materials, viewing them as threats to theological orthodoxy and ecclesiastical control. Yet suppression proved largely ineffective. Texts banned in one jurisdiction appeared in another. Materials condemned as heretical in official pronouncements continued circulating through underground networks of collectors and practitioners. The Book of Raziel specifically attracted attention from Christian scholars interested in Hebrew mysticism. The 16th and 17th centuries witnessed remarkable Christian engagement with Kabbalistic materials, part of broader Renaissance currents that sought wisdom in ancient sources. Christian Kabbalists like Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, Johannes Reuchlin, and Athanasius Kircher studied Jewish mystical texts, often interpreting them as prefigurations of Christian theological truths. They saw in the Hebrew divine names and angelic hierarchies confirmation of doctrines like the Trinity and the Incarnation. This Christian appropriation of Jewish mysticism created complex dynamics. On one hand, it reflected genuine intellectual curiosity and theological sophistication. These scholars learned Hebrew, consulted with Jewish teachers, and engaged seriously with rabbinic traditions. On the other hand, their interpretive framework fundamentally transformed the materials they studied. They extracted Kabbalistic concepts from their Jewish contexts and reframed them within Christian theological systems. Jewish mysticism became, in their hands, a tool for demonstrating Christian truths rather than an independent spiritual tradition worthy of respect on its own terms. The Book of Raziel entered Christian magical traditions through this complex process of transmission and transformation. elements from the grimoire appeared in Latin magical texts like the Arbatel de Magia Veterum and various versions of the Key of Solomon. Divine names from Raziel's angelic instruction became components of Christian ceremonial magic. The cosmological diagrams illustrating divine emanation were reinterpreted through Christian theological lenses. Angels originally understood within Jewish angelological systems were reimagined as servants of a Christian cosmos. This cross-cultural movement of magical knowledge raises important questions about authenticity and appropriation. When a text like the Book of Raziel moves from its original Jewish context into Christian magical practice, what happens to its meaning? Does it retain essential character despite changed interpretation, or does recontextualization fundamentally alter what it is? These questions lack simple answers. The grimoire both maintained certain core elements and underwent substantial transformation as it crossed religious and cultural boundaries. Similar dynamics operated as Western esotericism developed into a distinct intellectual tradition during the 18th and 19th centuries. The emergence of Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, and other initiatory societies created new contexts for the transmission of occult knowledge. These organizations drew eclectically on various mystical traditions, combining elements of Hermeticism, alchemy, Kabbalah, and ceremonial magic into syncretic systems. The Book of Raziel contributed to this eclectic mix, its concepts and practices extracted from Jewish contexts and recombined with materials from other sources. The occult revival of the late 19th century brought intensified interest in practical Kabbalah and Jewish magical traditions. Organizations like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn incorporated substantial Kabbalistic material into their ritual systems. The Golden Dawn's elaborate ceremonial magic drew heavily on grimoire traditions, including practices traceable to the Book of Raziel. Founders like Samuel Liddell, MacGregor Mathers studied Hebrew magical texts and integrated their techniques into the order's curriculum. Members learned to invoke angels using divine names, construct protective amulets with Hebrew letters, and meditate on cosmological diagrams derived from Kabbalistic sources. This Victorian occultism reflected its era's characteristic blend of romanticism and systematization. Practitioners approached magical traditions with quasi-scientific seriousness, attempting to codify practices into coherent systems. They created elaborate correspondences connecting Hebrew letters, divine names, angelic hierarchies, astrological signs, alchemical symbols, and tarot cards into comprehensive frameworks. These synthetic systems claimed ancient pedigrees while actually representing innovative 19th century constructions. They were simultaneously traditional and modern, drawing on historical sources while creating something fundamentally new. The influence of these Victorian occult organizations extended far beyond their immediate membership. Their publications and teachings shaped 20th century Western esotericism in profound ways. Magical practices developed within the Golden Dawn, and similar groups became the foundation for modern ceremonial magic traditions. Kabbalistic concepts they popularized entered broader New Age spirituality. Ideas about correspondences, ritual technique, and spiritual development that originated in these late 19th century contexts came to seem timeless and traditional, their relatively recent invention forgotten. The Book of Raziel's role in this process remained largely invisible to most modern practitioners. Few people working with Golden Dawn rituals or modern Kabbalistic magic recognized how much their practices derived from or were influenced by this medieval grimoire. The text operated as a largely unacknowledged source, its contents absorbed into later traditions in ways that obscured the original. This invisibility paradoxically testified to the grimoire's profound influence. Materials that become so thoroughly integrated into a tradition that they seem natural and inevitable rather than historical and contingent have achieved a kind of ultimate success. The 20th century brought new contexts for the transmission and transformation of grimoire traditions. The counterculture movements of the 1960s and 70s generated intense interest in alternative spiritualities and magical practices. Young people dissatisfied with mainstream religious institutions sought authentic spiritual experiences through various esoteric traditions. Eastern mysticism attracted many, but Western occult traditions also found new audiences. Publishers issued popular editions of medieval and Renaissance magical texts, making grimoires available to general readers for the first time. This democratization of occult knowledge differed significantly from earlier patterns of transmission. Traditional grimoire study had occurred within teacher-student relationships or lodge contexts where experienced practitioners guided newcomers through complex material. The new accessibility meant people encountered these texts without traditional frameworks for understanding them. Books that had been written for readers already grounded in mystical cosmologies and magical worldviews suddenly reached audiences with no such background. This created both opportunities and challenges. On one hand, making grimoires widely available honored the text's own claims to offer practical knowledge. The Book of Raziel had never presented itself as material requiring special initiation or institutional mediation. It addressed its reader directly, offering instruction on the assumption that the sincere seeker could learn and apply its teachings. Broad circulation fulfilled this democratic impulse implicit in the grimoire form itself. On the other hand, the removal of traditional learning contexts meant many readers approached these materials with inadequate preparation. Understanding a text like the Book of Raziel requires substantial background knowledge. Its Hebrew terminology, biblical allusions, cosmological assumptions, and ritual techniques all presuppose familiarity with broader traditions. Without such grounding, readers might extract isolated techniques while missing larger contexts that gave them meaning. The result was often a superficial engagement that captured surface elements while losing deeper dimensions. Contemporary paganism and modern witchcraft movements incorporated grimoire materials in particularly creative ways. Practitioners developed new magical systems that drew eclectically on various historical sources, including medieval Jewish magic. The Book of Raziel's approach to divine names, angel invocation, and practical techniques influenced these reconstructed traditions, though often in heavily adapted forms. Modern practitioners felt free to modify historical practices to suit contemporary sensibilities and needs, viewing themselves as continuing living traditions rather than preserving dead relics. This adaptive approach generated criticism from some quarters. Academic scholars objected to what they perceived as distortion of historical materials. Practitioners from traditional Jewish backgrounds sometimes criticized Christian or pagan use of Jewish magical techniques as cultural appropriation. These objections raised legitimate concerns about respect for source traditions and the ethics of cross-cultural borrowing. Yet the history of grimoire transmission suggests that texts like the Book of Raziel have always moved between contexts and undergone transformation in the process. The grimoire itself combined diverse sources into new synthesis. Medieval Jewish mysticism had absorbed elements from Babylonian, Greek, and Persian sources. Renaissance Christian Kabbalah reinterpreted Jewish materials for new purposes. Each generation and cultural context adapted received traditions to address its own concerns and questions. Contemporary appropriations, however problematic in specific instances, continued this long-standing pattern rather than representing unprecedented violation. The digital age has created yet another context for grimoire circulation and study. Medieval manuscripts, once accessible only to specialized scholars in rare book libraries, are now available online as high-resolution digital images. Editions and translations can be shared instantly across global networks. Online communities allow practitioners from different traditions to compare techniques and interpretations. This unprecedented accessibility transforms the landscape of esoteric study. The Book of Raziel participates fully in this digital transformation. Multiple manuscript versions can be examined and compared by anyone with internet access. Scholarly articles analyzing the text circulate freely through academic databases and file-sharing networks. Online forums devoted to practical Kabbalah and ceremonial magic discuss techniques derived from the grimoire. YouTube videos demonstrate its practices for visual learners. Podcast episodes explore its history and significance for audio audiences. This digital environment creates new possibilities but also new challenges. Information abundance makes discernment increasingly important. A seeker encountering the Book of Raziel through internet searches must navigate vast quantities of material varying enormously in quality and reliability. Accurate scholarly analysis appears alongside wild speculation and misinformation. Serious practitioners share space with casual dabblers. Traditional respect for the sacred character of these teachings coexists with consumerist approaches that treat ancient wisdom as just another consumer product. The question of how to approach such materials responsibly in contemporary contexts admits no simple answer. Different practitioners articulate different ethical frameworks. Some emphasize respect for source traditions, arguing that Jewish magical practices should remain within Jewish contexts or at least be studied with serious attention to their Jewish character. Others advocate universalist approaches, maintaining that spiritual techniques transcend cultural boundaries and belong to all humanity. Still others focus on personal authenticity, suggesting that sincere engagement matters more than cultural pedigree. The Book of Raziel itself offers little guidance on such questions, having been created in contexts where these particular concerns did not arise. The grimoire presents its knowledge as revealed wisdom from God to Adam, positioned as universal human patrimony rather than the possession of any particular cultural group. Yet this universalist framing occurred within specifically Jewish contexts and employed thoroughly Jewish symbolic systems. The text simultaneously claims universal relevance and reflects particular cultural rootedness. This tension between universal and particular dimensions characterizes many wisdom traditions. Teachings often claim to address fundamental human concerns that transcend cultural boundaries while simultaneously emerging from and being shaped by specific historical and cultural contexts. Navigating this tension requires acknowledging both dimensions without collapsing one into the other. The Book of Raziel speaks to perennial human concerns about meaning, protection, and connection with sacred reality, concerns that genuinely cross cultural boundaries. It addresses these universal concerns through specifically Jewish mystical frameworks that reflect particular historical developments and cultural contexts. Both dimensions matter. Contemporary academic study of the grimoire has illuminated its historical contexts and developmental processes with increasing sophistication. Scholars have traced its textual sources, mapped manuscript traditions, analyzed its relationship to other mystical works, and situated it within broader patterns of Jewish religious culture. This historical scholarship provides crucial context for understanding what the text meant in its original settings. It reveals how medieval Jewish communities engaged with sacred knowledge, how they understood divine reality, how they conceptualized the relationship between spiritual and material dimensions. Yet historical understanding, however valuable, does not exhaust the significance of such a text. The Book of Raziel has always been more than a historical artifact. It has functioned as a living resource for spiritual practice, a guide for engaging with what its tradition considers ultimate reality. This practical dimension means the grimoire continues to generate meaning beyond what historical analysis can capture. People still use its techniques, still meditate on its cosmological diagrams, still invoke the angels it describes. For these practitioners, the text is not merely an interesting historical document, but a functional spiritual tool. This gap between historical and practical approaches creates ongoing tensions in how such materials are studied and discussed. Academics committed to historical methodology may view practitioner claims with skepticism, seeing them as projecting contemporary concerns onto historical materials. Practitioners may regard purely historical approaches as missing the point, studying the text's shells while ignoring its living core. Each perspective captures something important while also missing dimensions the other emphasizes. Perhaps the most fruitful approach recognizes the legitimacy of both perspectives while acknowledging their different purposes and methods. Historical scholarship illuminates how texts functioned in original contexts, what they meant to their authors and earliest audiences, how they related to broader cultural patterns. This knowledge matters for anyone seeking informed engagement with such materials. Practitioners who understand historical contexts can work with greater awareness of what they are doing, recognizing where their practices align with or diverge from traditional approaches. Simultaneously, practical engagement with spiritual techniques described in historical texts can generate insights inaccessible through historical analysis alone. Someone who actually practices meditation with Hebrew letters, who attempts the invocations and constructs the amulets, who struggles to comprehend and apply the cosmological frameworks, this person encounters dimensions of the text that purely intellectual study might miss. The difference resembles that between reading about swimming and actually entering the water. Both activities have value, but they provide different kinds of knowledge. The enduring significance of the Book of Raziel across these various contexts suggests something important about the nature of wisdom traditions. Texts that speak powerfully to fundamental human concerns can maintain relevance across vast spans of time and dramatic shifts in cultural context. The specific cosmology the grimoire presents may no longer match how most contemporary people understand reality. Few now believe in a cosmos structured according to medieval Kabbalistic principles, with divine emanations descending through angelic hierarchies to manifest in material reality. Modern physics and cosmology describe the universe in radically different terms. Yet certain core insights the grimoire embodies retain resonance. The conviction that reality has depths beyond material surfaces, that consciousness can engage with these deeper dimensions, that proper knowledge and technique enable such engagement, these fundamental claims continue attracting serious interest. The specific frameworks may seem archaic, but the underlying recognition that human existence involves more than material concerns, this persists across changing worldviews. Similarly, the practices the grimoire describes address perennial human needs. People still seek protection from harm, still desire healing for illness, still want understanding of difficult situations, still hope for guidance in crucial decisions. The specific techniques medieval Jews employed to address these needs may seem strange or superstitious from modern perspectives. Yet the underlying impulse, the desire to access resources beyond ordinary capacities, this remains immediately recognizable and deeply human. The grimoire's emphasis on consciousness transformation rather than mere external results also resonates with contemporary spiritual sensibilities. Modern practitioners of various mystical traditions emphasize inner development, the cultivation of awareness and understanding, rather than focus narrowly on material outcomes. This orientation aligns closely with how the Book of Raziel presented its practices as means of elevation and purification that enabled engagement with sacred reality. The specific vocabulary has changed, but the fundamental emphasis on consciousness as the primary domain of spiritual work persists. The role of language in spiritual practice, another major theme in the grimoire, continues generating serious interest. Contemporary cognitive science and linguistic philosophy have complicated simplistic views of language as merely referential, showing how words shape thought and perception in profound ways. Sacred language traditions appear less primitive when understood through these frameworks. The Book of Raziel's emphasis on Hebrew letters as fundamental building blocks of reality, while clearly metaphysical rather than scientific, expresses insights about the constitutive role of language that find echoes in modern theoretical discussions. The grimoire's approach to divine names similarly invites reconsideration. Modern readers might initially dismiss the notion that specific combinations of Hebrew letters carry inherent power as primitive word magic. Yet traditions emphasizing sacred language point towards something more subtle, the way that focused attention on carefully constructed verbal formulae can organize consciousness and facilitate particular states of awareness. Whether divine names work through supernatural power or through psychological mechanisms remains debatable, but that they can produce notable effects in the consciousness of practitioners appears increasingly difficult to dismiss. The meditative practices the text describes also align with contemporary understanding of contemplative techniques. Sustained focused attention on particular symbols or verbal formulae serves functions that contemplative traditions worldwide have recognized. Such practices quiet ordinary mental chatter, enabling access to subtler states of consciousness. They focus awareness in ways that reveal patterns normally overlooked. They cultivate capacities for concentration and mental clarity that serve both spiritual and practical purposes. The specific symbols and formulae a tradition employs matter less than the quality of attention brought to them. Understanding these practices in psychological terms need not reduce them to mere mental techniques devoid of spiritual significance. The dichotomy between psychological and spiritual often proves less absolute than modern categories suggest. States of consciousness cultivated through contemplative practice feel subjectively profound and meaningful, regardless of theoretical frameworks used to explain them. Whether one attributes such experiences to contact with transcendent realities or to unusual brain states becomes almost secondary to the experiences themselves and their effects on the practitioner's life and understanding. The ethical dimension of the grimoire tradition also warrants attention. The Book of Raziel emphasized that sacred knowledge required proper character and ethical standing. Only the worthy could safely access and successfully employ its teachings. This ethical emphasis distinguished it from purely technical approaches to magic that treat spiritual practices as morally neutral tools. The grimoire insisted that the practitioner's inner state, their intentions, character, and moral standing directly affected their capacity to work with sacred powers. This ethical orientation reflected broader Jewish religious emphasis on righteousness as essential to relationship with divine reality. One could not separate spiritual technique from moral character. Attempts to employ sacred knowledge for unworthy purposes or from impure motivations would fail or backfire. This framework positioned spiritual practice within comprehensive moral universes rather than treating it as isolated technical activity. Contemporary magical and mystical traditions vary in how strongly they emphasize ethical considerations. Some maintain that spiritual techniques require ethical grounding and that character development is inseparable from spiritual development. Others take more instrumental approaches, treating practices as tools that can serve various purposes depending on user intentions. This variation reflects differing views about the nature of spiritual power and its relationship to moral order. The Book of Raziel's position on these matters, while clearly stated in principle, remained somewhat ambiguous in practice. The text emphasized worthiness and purity, yet it also offered powerful techniques that could theoretically serve various purposes. This tension between ethical ideals and practical ambiguity characterized many grimoire traditions. They acknowledged that knowledge could be misused, while still transmitting that knowledge to those deemed ready. This approach differs significantly from purely protective strategies that attempt to prevent dangerous knowledge from spreading. The grimoire tradition generally assumed that powerful knowledge would inevitably circulate, and that the better response involved cultivating discernment in practitioners rather than maintaining impossible barriers around information. This represents a fundamentally educational rather than restrictive approach to dangerous knowledge. The question of how contemporary contexts should handle such material remains actively debated. Some argue that ancient magical knowledge should be restricted to serious practitioners within traditional contexts who can provide appropriate guidance. Others maintain that information should be freely available, trusting individuals to make responsible choices. Still others advocate middle positions that make information accessible while emphasizing the importance of proper preparation and ethical grounding. The Book of Raziel itself, through its complex transmission history, has already answered this question in practice, if not in principle. The text has circulated increasingly widely, moving well beyond its original contexts of traditional Jewish mysticism into diverse contemporary settings. This circulation has produced varied results. Some practitioners have engaged deeply and seriously with the material, developing substantial understanding and meaningful practice. Others have treated it superficially, extracting interesting techniques while missing deeper dimensions. Still others have distorted or misused elements in problematic ways. This mixed outcome reflects the inevitable consequences of making powerful knowledge widely available. Expanded access creates both opportunities and risks. More people gain chances to encounter profound wisdom, traditions, and develop meaningful spiritual practices. Simultaneously, more opportunities arise for misunderstanding, superficial engagement, and inappropriate application. The question becomes whether the opportunities outweigh the risks and how to maximize the former while minimizing the latter. Education emerges as crucial regardless of one's position on accessibility. Whether materials like the Book of Raziel should circulate freely or remain restricted, those who do encounter them need substantial support in understanding what they have found. This requires resources that explain historical contexts, clarify terminology and concepts, distinguish different textual layers, and provide frameworks for responsible engagement. Such educational infrastructure remains underdeveloped relative to the amount of esoteric material now easily accessible. Contemporary interest in grimoire traditions reflects broader patterns in modern spirituality. As traditional religious institutions decline and in many cultural contexts, individuals increasingly construct personal spiritual paths, drawing eclectically on diverse sources. This religious individualism and eclecticism generates criticism from those who value coherent tradition and institutional continuity. Yet it also represents genuine spiritual seeking by people dissatisfied with conventional options. The Book of Raziel serves such contemporary seekers well in some respects. Its practical orientation provides concrete techniques rather than purely abstract theology. Its emphasis on individual effort and direct experience aligns with modern preferences for personal spiritual authority rather than institutional mediation. Its combination of wonder and rationality appeals to sensibilities that want both mystical experience and intellectual coherence. The text offers genuine substance to those willing to engage seriously with its demanding material. At the same time, approaching such texts without traditional contexts and guidance creates significant challenges. The grimoire assumed readers shared certain basic frameworks, understood particular concepts, and had received fundamental preparation. Contemporary readers often lack such grounding. They may bring New Age assumptions that poorly fit the material's original context. They may project contemporary psychological concepts onto medieval cosmological frameworks. They may extract techniques while missing the comprehensive worldviews that gave those techniques meaning and purpose. These challenges are not insurmountable, but addressing them requires intentional effort. Modern seekers who wish to engage seriously with traditions like the Book of Raziel must invest substantial time and energy in learning contexts and frameworks. This might involve studying medieval Jewish history and mysticism, learning at least basic Hebrew, reading widely in Kabbalistic literature, finding teachers or communities that work with these materials, and maintaining patient-sustained practice rather than seeking quick results. Such dedicated engagement remains rare relative to the number of people who express casual interest in mystical traditions. Most contemporary encounter with materials like the Book of Raziel proves brief and superficial. People read popular books about grimoires, watch documentaries about Jewish mysticism, perhaps purchase an edition of the text, but few proceed to serious sustained study and practice. This pattern of widespread shallow interest with rare deep engagement characterizes much contemporary spirituality. Yet even limited engagement may have value. Brief exposure to profound wisdom traditions can plant seeds that later grow into deeper interest. Initial superficial encounters sometimes evolve into serious lifelong study. Not everyone who touches such material needs to become an expert practitioner. Even casual familiarity with the existence and basic character of traditions like that represented by the Book of Raziel enriches cultural literacy and broadens awareness of human spiritual diversity. The grimoire's influence on Western popular culture provides another dimension of its contemporary significance. Elements from the Book of Raziel and related traditions appear regularly in fiction, film, television, and games. Angels with Hebrew names, divine names of power, mystical cosmologies, protective amulets. These motifs drawn from Jewish magical traditions circulate widely through entertainment media. This popularization brings both benefits and costs. On the positive side, such cultural presence maintains awareness of these traditions and may spark serious interest in some who encounter them through popular media. Young people who meet Kabbalistic concepts in fantasy novels or television shows sometimes pursue further study that leads to genuine engagement with the source traditions. Popular culture can serve as a gateway to deeper knowledge for those inclined to pass through it. On the negative side, popularization often involves significant distortion. Entertainment media typically present simplified, sensationalized versions of complex traditions. The Book of Raziel's sophisticated cosmology becomes generic fantasy magic. Its carefully structured practices reduced to mysterious gestures and dramatic words. Its ethical framework disappears entirely, replaced by morally simplistic conflicts between good and evil forces. Audiences consuming such content may believe they understand Jewish mysticism when they actually possess only cartoon versions that obscure more than they reveal. This distortion cannot be entirely prevented in translation between esoteric tradition and mass media. Popular entertainment serves different purposes than spiritual instruction. It seeks to engage broad audiences through compelling narratives and dramatic images rather than transmit complex knowledge and techniques. Expecting popular culture to accurately represent mystical traditions is unrealistic. The question becomes whether any positive effects of increased awareness outweigh the negative effects of distortion. Perhaps the answer varies by individual case. For some people, popularized versions lead to serious investigation of source traditions. For others, distorted representations satisfy curiosity without prompting deeper inquiry. The net effect on the tradition itself is difficult to assess. Wider name recognition may help or harm, depending on how that recognition shapes public perception. The Book of Raziel's journey from its medieval origins through Renaissance esotericism, Victorian occultism, 20th century counterculture, and contemporary digital accessibility illustrates how wisdom traditions adapt to changing contexts while maintaining certain core elements. The specific forms of transmission have transformed dramatically. Medieval manuscripts circulating among small groups of Jewish mystics differ radically from YouTube videos reaching global audiences. The interpretive frameworks have shifted fundamentally. Medieval cosmological assumptions bear little resemblance to modern scientific worldviews. Yet beneath these profound changes, certain continuities persist. Human beings still seek meaning beyond material existence. They still desire protection from harm and healing for suffering. They still hope to access wisdom and guidance from sources beyond ordinary consciousness. They still sense that reality has depths that everyday awareness normally misses. These perennial human concerns ensure continued interest in traditions that address them, even when the specific forms those traditions take seem increasingly alien. The grimoire's presentation of revealed wisdom given by angels to humanity speaks to these enduring concerns. Whether one accepts the literal framework of angelic transmission or interprets it as metaphorical expression of intuitive insight accessed through altered states of consciousness matters less than recognizing the universal human experience it addresses. Throughout history and across cultures, people have reported receiving knowledge and guidance from sources they perceived as beyond their ordinary identity. The specific interpretive frameworks they use to make sense of such experiences vary enormously, but the experiences themselves show remarkable consistency. The Book of Raziel gave medieval Jewish mystics one framework for understanding and working with such experiences. It offered concepts, techniques, and practices that enabled them to deliberately cultivate states of consciousness in which such contact became more likely. It provided language for articulating what they encountered and methods for integrating insights into practical life. The framework served these functions effectively enough to be transmitted across generations and adapted by different communities. Contemporary practitioners who work with this tradition face the challenge of engaging genuinely with its substance while acknowledging the historical and cultural distance separating them from original contexts. This requires holding several dimensions simultaneously. One must respect the tradition's own self-understanding, taking seriously its claims about angelic revelation and divine wisdom rather than immediately reducing them to psychological projections. Simultaneously, one must maintain critical awareness of historical development and cultural construction, recognizing how the tradition reflects particular times and places rather than timeless universal truth. This balance between openness and critical distance is difficult to maintain. The tendency gravitates toward one extreme or the other. Either people accept traditional claims literally and uncritically, ignoring historical evidence that complicates such acceptance, or they adopt reductive interpretations that dismiss the tradition's spiritual dimensions as primitive superstition. Finding middle ground that honors both empirical reality and spiritual possibility requires sustained intellectual and spiritual effort. The same tension operates in practical engagement with the grimoire's techniques. One can approach them as exercises in historical reenactment, performing practices as medieval Jews did them while maintaining scholarly distance. This approach provides valuable experiential data about what such practices involved and how they affected practitioners. Yet it risks remaining external, going through motions without genuine investment in the practice's spiritual dimensions. Alternatively, one can engage practices as living techniques, setting aside historical concerns to focus on what they produce in contemporary consciousness. This approach may generate profound experiences and practical benefits. Yet it risks losing important contextual understanding and projecting contemporary assumptions onto materials that originally meant something quite different. The most fruitful approach probably combines both dimensions. One engages practices seriously and sincerely, bringing genuine openness to whatever they might reveal, while simultaneously maintaining awareness of historical and cultural contexts. This doubled consciousness admits complexity and contradiction. It allows for the possibility that ancient techniques might still work in some sense, while also recognizing that contemporary experience of them inevitably differs from medieval experience. It takes seriously both the tradition's own claims and the insights of historical scholarship. This complex engagement ultimately honors the Book of Raziel and the tradition it represents more fully than either uncritical acceptance or dismissive reduction. The text deserves to be encountered on its own terms, understood within its contexts, and evaluated according to whether it delivers what it promises. This requires sustained attention to detail, willingness to sit with ambiguity, and patience with material that resists easy comprehension. Such demanding engagement will never appeal to mass audiences. Most contemporary interest in grimoires and mystical traditions remains casual and superficial. Yet for the smaller number who pursue serious study and practice, materials like the Book of Raziel offer remarkable resources. They provide access to sophisticated systems of spiritual technique developed over centuries by dedicated practitioners. They embody accumulated wisdom about consciousness, reality, and the relationship between them. They connect contemporary seekers to ancient traditions of human spiritual exploration. The question of whether such traditions contain objective truth or represent culturally specific constructions may ultimately be unanswerable and perhaps unnecessary to answer definitively. Even if one concludes that the cosmological frameworks are mythological rather than literally true, the practices developed within those frameworks might still effectively produce particular states of consciousness and their associated benefits. Even if angelic hierarchies have no objective existence, meditation techniques designed to contact them might still generate profound experiences. The pragmatic question of what works may matter more than the metaphysical question of what is ultimately real. This pragmatic orientation aligns well with the Book of Raziel's own practical emphasis. The grimoire never presented itself as purely theoretical theology, but as functional knowledge meant for application. It described techniques and practices, then instructed readers to perform them. The proof of the teaching lay in its effects on those who properly applied it. This same pragmatic criterion remains available to contemporary practitioners. Does working with these materials produce the kinds of results the tradition describes? Do the practices facilitate the consciousness transformations they claim to enable? Does the knowledge prove useful for living more wisely and compassionately? These questions invite experimental engagement rather than a priori acceptance or rejection. One need not believe in angels to attempt angelic invocations and observe what occurs. One need not accept medieval cosmology to practice meditation with Hebrew letters and notice the effects. The techniques themselves can be tested regardless of the theoretical frameworks in which they were originally embedded. This experimental approach respects both the tradition and critical thinking. The results of such experiments will vary among practitioners depending on numerous factors. Personal psychology, prior experiences, cultural background, quality of instruction, consistency of practice, and many other variables influence outcomes. What works powerfully for one person may produce little effect for another. This variability need not invalidate either positive or negative results. Spiritual practices, like therapeutic techniques, show differential effectiveness across different individuals and circumstances. The accumulated testimony of practitioners across centuries suggests that at least for some people, under some circumstances, the kinds of practices the Book of Raziel describes can produce notable effects. People report experiences of heightened awareness, encounters with apparently autonomous presences, access to information they had no normal means of obtaining, sudden insights that resolve long-standing questions, and various other phenomena that the tradition attributes to successful practice. While such reports admit various explanations, their consistency across time and culture suggests something significant occurs beyond mere self-delusion or autosuggestion. At minimum, these practices demonstrate that human consciousness has capacities far exceeding those typically accessed in ordinary life. The technologies of consciousness developed by mystical traditions worldwide reveal how different mental states can be deliberately cultivated and how these states provide access to different modes of knowing and experiencing. Whether these different modes contact objectively real spiritual dimensions or represent unusual configurations of brain activity becomes almost secondary to the phenomenological reality of what practitioners experience and the effects these experiences have on their lives. The Book of Raziel stands as one exemplar among many of humanity's long exploration of consciousness and its possibilities. It represents one tradition's attempt to map inner territory, develop reliable techniques for navigating that territory, and transmit both maps and techniques to subsequent generations. The specific maps and techniques reflect the tradition's particular historical and cultural contexts. Yet the underlying impulse, the drive to explore consciousness and develop methods for accessing its fuller capacities, this represents something universal in human experience. Every culture has produced contemplatives, mystics, and spiritual adepts who dedicated themselves to exploring consciousness and its relationship to reality. The methods they developed vary enormously in detail, while showing remarkable convergence in broad outline. Focused attention, regulated breathing, physical stillness, mental quieting, work with symbols and verbal formulae, cultivation of particular emotional and intentional states, these elements appear repeatedly across diverse traditions. The convergence suggests these techniques address something fundamental about how consciousness functions rather than representing arbitrary cultural constructions. The Book of Raziel packages these universal elements within specifically Jewish frameworks. It uses Hebrew language and letters as primary symbolic vehicles. It draws on biblical and rabbinic traditions for its cosmological assumptions. It works with angels and divine names specific to Jewish theology. These particular forms matter greatly for practitioners working within Jewish contexts. They provide culturally resonant symbols and practices that integrate spiritual work with broader religious identity and community. For practitioners from other backgrounds, the particularity of these forms creates both challenges and opportunities. The challenge involves engaging material from an unfamiliar tradition that uses categories and concepts not native to one's own cultural background. This requires learning new vocabulary, new ways of thinking, new symbolic systems. The effort can feel daunting, like learning a foreign language from scratch. Yet precisely this foreignness creates opportunity. Encountering a tradition sufficiently different from one's own assumptions can reveal how culturally conditioned those assumptions are. It can open awareness to alternative possibilities for understanding reality and structuring spiritual practice. The strangeness of the material forces one to think more carefully and critically rather than relying on familiar categories that might obscure as much as they reveal. This educational value of encountering genuinely different traditions argues for maintaining the particularity of materials like the Book of Raziel rather than attempting to translate them into more generic spiritual language. While such translation might make them more immediately accessible, it risks losing precisely those elements that make them valuable, their specific character that reflects and preserves distinct ways of approaching ultimate concerns. Contemporary spiritual eclecticism often treats different traditions as interchangeable variants expressing the same underlying truths. This perennialist perspective has value in recognizing common elements across diverse traditions. Yet it can also flatten important differences, obscuring the distinctive insights particular traditions offer. The Book of Raziel's specifically Jewish character makes it what it is. Attempts to extract universal spiritual techniques while discarding the Jewish framework fundamentally change the material. This does not mean non-Jews cannot meaningfully engage the tradition. But such engagement requires respecting its particularity rather than domesticating it into more familiar forms. It means learning enough about Jewish religious culture to understand the tradition on something approaching its own terms. It means acknowledging one's position as outsider rather than claiming insider status. It means approaching the material with humility appropriate to encountering wisdom one has not inherited. These considerations about cultural appropriation and respect for source traditions become increasingly important as materials once restricted to small communities circulate globally. Easy access creates responsibility for thoughtful engagement. One can be grateful for the opportunity to encounter profound traditions while remaining aware of the ethical complexities involved in such encounter. The answer is not necessarily to refrain entirely from engaging traditions outside one's heritage, but rather to do so with awareness, respect, and appropriate humility. The Book of Raziel will continue circulating and being adapted by diverse practitioners in various contexts. This process cannot be prevented, and perhaps should not be even if it could. Wisdom traditions have always moved between cultures, undergoing transformation in the process. Yet those who receive such traditions from outside their original contexts bear responsibility for engaging them thought.